We want to make sure that when we start on any device, we can see the bottom left corner of our scene, which makes sense, since this is where we will launch our birds from. So we should see them right when the app starts. And by app starts, I mean, of course, when our level starts. By default, we can see the center of our scene, which does make sense for us. To achieve what we want in SpriteKit, we can use a camera with an SK camera node. But I won't do it in the scene editor here. I will go over into my game scene file, since this is where I will define it. I can later access the camera and manipulate its properties if needed. I start by adding it as a property to my game scene class. It will be a constant called GameCamera, initialized as an SK camera node. I want to add my camera as soon as my scene becomes visible, but I won't do it right in the didMoveToView method. Instead, I will create a custom method to add the camera, and I will call it addCamera. It won't have any parameters nor return values, and I want to call it from my didMoveToView method. But how can I initialize my camera? As with any other node, I will have to add it as a child node to my scene, which I can easily do by calling the addChild method and passing GameCamera as the node that I want to add. I would then set the position for my camera. A camera node doesn't actually have an anchor point, but when setting its position, we are actually sending the position of the center point of its point of view. So you can kind of think of it as having an anchor point at 0.5. In order to see the bottom left edge of our scene, but nothing that comes left or below it, we should position our camera slightly to the right and up from our origin point. So let's set the camera.position to a new CG point instance with X and Y coordinates. Why don't you try and come up with the exact coordinates we will have to use for this position, so that we just see the bottom left corner at the very edge of our camera. A little hint, the frame of our camera will automatically be the same size as the screen size of our current device. I do have a view in my SpriteKit app, in my view controller, from which I can naturally get the size of my current device. So, here's how you can do it. You set the x coordinate to view.bounds.size.width divided by 2. And we do get an error here, but I can easily fix this at the very beginning of our addCamera method, where I will add a guard statement by writing guard let view is view else return. With this statement, we just check if the view property contains a value, and if so, bind it to a local view constant that is non-optional, and we can then use this constant where we set our position. I can then delete the question mark here, and my error is gone. By positioning my camera at this X position, I will move it halfway to the right side of my screen. And I now want to do the same thing for my Y position, except this time we will of course use the height. So let's write view.bounds.size.height divided by 2. This should position our camera correctly, so that we can see the bottom left edge of our scene and nothing further. But before we can actually run the app to see if this works, I will also have to use this camera as the camera for our scene by setting it as its camera property. An SK scene has an optional camera property. If we are not using a camera in the game, the scene will just be displayed in its original size, which can look different on different devices. We can, however, set a camera which would then allow us to adjust the frame that we can see. We can access the camera property by writing camera, and I now want to set it to GameCamera, so the camera we've just initialized. Before we run our app to see if this worked, I will have to go back to my view controller, where we have to change something. And that is the scale mode of our scene, which as of now is set to aspect fill. If I right click on this and jump to its definition, I can see that for the scale modes fill, aspect fill, and aspect fit, our SK scene gets scaled, which we can see in the comments here. For the last case, resize, fill, our scene isn't scaled, but the actual size is modified. And that's exactly what we want with our camera. The reason being that if we scale our scene, the positioning of our camera in relation to the view's size won't work. So back in the game view controller file, let's change scale mode to .resize fill. By doing so, we ensure that our scene, which in this case is the scene of our SKS file, will not be scaled in any way, which would result in difficulties when positioning and manipulating our camera. And that should be it. I will now run the app again to see if all of this works. If it did, we should now, on the iPhone X, see the bottom left edge of our scene. The app started, and I can now see my ground tiles and exactly the frame that I wanted to see. We also don't have any black edges or parts where we can see below our scene, which is exactly what we want. The next thing we want to do is make sure that on these smaller screens where we can't see our whole scene, we have some kind of possibility to pan around and move our scene. We want to be able to just pan our scene by swiping on it, and maybe use a pinch gesture to zoom in and out. Before we do so, I want to clean up my project a little bit by using groups in my navigator, which will later on be really beneficial for finding stuff quickly. I will, after right-clicking the birds folder, create new groups, beginning with UI, template, view controller, and scenes. Let's delete the UI folder, since we only want to have a group here and not an actual folder. So I will re-add it as a group without a folder. I will drag my asset catalog and the two storyboard files into the UI group. My scene files will be added to the scenes group. The game view controller will be added to the view controller group. App delegate and info.plist go into the template group. And then I will create another group called tilesets, where I want to drag my bird tiles into. While this step with organizing our project isn't mandatory, I really recommend it, especially for larger projects like this one. You should always take a moment and do this, since it will massively improve the clarity of the structure so that you can find files a lot easier and quicker. But now we want to implement some ways for moving around in our game, and we will of course do so in our game scene file in the game scene class.